When you think of Bonnie Prince Charlie, you probably picture kilts, broadswords, and this really romantic, tragic story. But peel back that layer, and you'll find a raw story of political ambition, a fight for cultural identity, and a rebellion that came unbelievably close to toppling the entire British crown. It's a chapter of history that's as bloody as it is misunderstood. So let's start at the end, right here, on this haunting, windswept field, Culloden Moor. This was the site of the last pitched battle ever fought on British soil. I mean, it's a place that, even today, just feels heavy with the weight of everything that was lost.
Now, a lot of people think this was a simple case of Scotland versus England. But the reality? Oh, it was way more complicated. This was a civil war. It pitted Highlander against Lowlander, Catholic against Protestant, and one royal family, the Stuarts, against another, the Hanovers. To get why this battle even happened, we've got to unravel the cause. All right, so to really get this, we need to jump in the time machine and go back a bit. The roots of this whole conflict were planted decades before Bonnie Prince Charlie was even born, during a crisis that shook the British monarchy to its absolute core. It all kicks off in 1688. The Protestant establishment gets really nervous about their Catholic king, James II. So they basically invite his Protestant daughter, Mary, to come take the throne. James flees to France, and right away, new laws get passed to make sure a Catholic never rules again. So fast forward a bit, the last Protestant Stuart queen dies, and the crown completely bypasses James's son and goes to this distant German cousin, George of Hanover. For a lot of people, this wasn't just a change in leadership, it was a total theft of the throne. And the folks who believed this, well, they got a name: Jacobites. It's a pretty simple name, actually. It just comes from Jacobus, which is Latin for James. They believed that King James and his family were the one true divinely appointed line of kings.
Period.
So, for decades, this whole cause was just kind of bubbling under the surface, with a few failed uprisings here and there. But what it really needed was a spark, a charismatic leader to ignite that flame one last time. And that leader was Charles Edward Stuart. So picture this. Charles is born in total luxury, but in exile in a palace in Rome. He's raised on one single idea. The British throne is his birthright, and it was stolen from his family. He was charming, he was an optimist, and he was completely obsessed. His dad, who some called the Old Pretender, he was in no shape to lead another rebellion. So he makes his 25-year-old son, Charles, the Prince Regent, giving him full power to go and get their crowns back. And so began the last, the most famous, the most legendary Jacobite uprising. History knows it simply as the 45. The start of this thing is just wild. Charles lands on a remote Scottish island with just 7 companions. I mean, 7! At first, the clan chiefs basically told him to go home. But his charisma, his sheer willpower, it won them over. He raises the Stuart flag at Glenfinnan, and soon clan after clan rallies to his side. His army gets huge, they capture Edinburgh, they crush a government army at Prestonpans, and then they start a daring march south, straight for London. And get this, they made it all the way to Derby. That is just 150 miles from London. The capital was in a complete panic. Banks were collapsing. King George II was reportedly packing his bags, ready to bolt back to Germany. The Jacobites were literally on the verge of winning it all. But this is where the dream started to fall apart. His commanders, they got nervous. The English support they were banking on, it never showed up. And the French invasion they were promised, nowhere to be seen. They were deep in enemy territory, and government armies were closing in. They told him they had to retreat back to Scotland. A heartbroken Charles, well, he reluctantly agreed. And that was it. That was the turning point. But hold on, how did they even get that far in the first place? What was the secret sauce? To understand what convinced thousands of people to risk absolutely everything for a prince they'd never even met, we have to look beyond simple loyalty to a king. Well, as the historian F.T. McGlynn points out, after the Act of Union joined the Scottish and English parliaments back in 1707, the Jacobite cause got all tangled up with Scottish nationalism. For so many, putting a Stuart king back on the throne also meant getting a Scottish parliament back. It meant restoring Scotland's independence. It was a fight for their very identity. And this is where culture basically became a weapon. Tartan, the Gaelic language, traditional music, these weren't just customs anymore. They were symbols of defiance.
Jacobite soldiers wore a white cockade, just like the one you see here on their bonnets. It was a simple but really powerful way to say, this is who I am, and this is what I'm fighting for.
But the rebellion had another driving force. It's one that's often overlooked in the history books, but it was absolutely critical to why they were so successful at the start.
Meet the women of the Jacobite cause. People like Lady Margaret Nairn and Lady Winifred Nithsdale, they weren't just sitting on the sidelines. No way. They were the strategists. They were the fundraisers. They were the engine of this movement for decades.
Seriously, by 1745, a lot of the male clan leaders were tired of failed rebellions and were getting cold feet. It was the women who gave the critical push. Colonel Anne McIntosh famously raised hundreds of men for the prince, even defying her own husband, who was loyal to the government. In countless homes, women were persuading their husbands and sons to join up. It is no exaggeration to say that without them, the 45 uprising might never have even gotten off the ground. And this brings us back to where we started, the rebellion's tragic end. After that long retreat from England, the exhausted, outnumbered Jacobite army finally turned to face the government forces on Culloden Moor. Now, the Jacobites had this signature move, the Highland Charge, and it was absolutely terrifying. Imagine this screaming rush of men, a single volley of musket fire to create a smokescreen, and then a ferocious attack with broadswords. It had worked like a charm before, but at Culloden, the battlefield itself was the enemy. The ground was wet and boggy, and it just robbed the charge of its speed, turning the Highlanders into sitting ducks for the government cannons. And just like that, in less than 60 minutes, it was all over. The Jacobite army was annihilated. The dream was gone forever. What came next was just brutal. The government commander, the Duke of Cumberland, earned the nickname Butcher for what he did. The wounded were killed right there on the battlefield. The government then systematically set about dismantling Highland culture. They banned tartan. They outlawed bagpipes, calling them a weapon of war. They destroyed the traditional clan system. This was an attempt to erase an entire way of life. And what about the prince? He became a fugitive with a massive bounty on his head. For months, Highlanders risked their own lives to hide him. And of course, there's his legendary escape, disguised as an Irish maid named Betty Burke, with the help of the incredibly brave Flora MacDonald. That story alone cemented his romantic image for centuries. He did eventually escape to France, but he never set foot in Scotland again. And so that leaves us with this big question, right? The rebellion was a total disaster that led to the destruction of a culture. The prince failed. So why has this legend, the legend of Bonnie Prince Charlie, endured for all these years? Well, maybe it's because the story of the doomed prince and his lost cause, it speaks to something universal in all of us, that longing for what might have been. It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just written by the winners. It's also remembered and sometimes cherished by the losers.